There. So this is a tutorial video that talks about and shows how to edit items. So to put data into the basic items on the diagram. Here we've got a diagram that's already a little bit set up. So we have some structure added from the symbols here. We've got some function added by the symbols here in this section over here on the left. But we don't have any information here in the timeline. So far, nothing's really happened in this family, and no one has any names. We don't know when any of these behaviors took place, this kind of thing. So the first thing you would want to do is you'd want to give someone a name and a birth date and that kind of stuff. So what you do is you go and double click a person. Just click them here, and you can click them once, and then I said double click, but really you can click the person once to select them and then click this inspect button here, or you can just double click and it opens up a panel here with the information on this person. You can see that they're currently unnamed, but if I type this in, I'll name this person John, and it updates the name up here. So now you know you're editing John, right? And then here, I'm going to zoom in with my trackpad. Here you can see that this person's name is John. Oops, I closed it. So let's just do that again. And then I'll give them a last name, Smith. There, it updates the name here, and you can see the name updated here. So this title is here just to help remind you that everything under this box pertains to this one person. You can set the size on the diagram all the way down to a very, very small size. There's a small little box there. You can set what kind of symbol they are. And there's a few options here that you can use however you want. You can set the age. You just type in a number there. And you can set the birth date. And so instead of typing the age, I'm actually going to type in the birth date. And I'm going to type in my birth date. And the format is 2 numbers for month, 2 numbers for the day, 4 for the year. I just type that in, and you'll see that this optional date picker changes along with it. So these are in sync. But my birth date's May 11th, 1980, so I'm going to do that. And then when I'm done, I can just hit enter. Once I click in there, or rather click out of it, I suppose that's how it works. And it updates the age according to today's date. So remember that today's date is shown up here at the very top. Rather, the date that is shown in the diagram currently is shown in the top. So it shows today as at the day that is shown in the diagram is indicated up here, and that's the only indicator you have for it outside of this green bar here. But it doesn't actually give you the month and day. This is more of a macro level control here. So now you'll look down here and you can see that now we have some numbers here on the timeline. And what it's done is it's added in today's date. There's a circle for today's date, and then it's also added in a circle on this timeline, or a point for the date that I added here, the very first date of data in this diagram. So if I go back to, if I pull this backwards, you'll see, watch here as I drag this bar, it updates the day that is currently shown in the diagram up here in the title bar. See how they're in sync. And as it does that, it updates the age of that person there because it knows the birth date and it knows the date that's currently being shown, and it just does the math. And all the while, the age stays the same because this is just a way to easily calculate the date, the birth date. So if I were to go in here and type 45 and hit enter, it actually updates the birth date for me according to today's date, real date, which happens to be March 4th or March 5th. What is today? It's March 4th. So what it does is it takes today and it subtracts 45 years and then just sets these month and day values to January 1st because this is an estimator of birth date. And I personally use the convention where if I don't know a month or a day, I just say the first. I just say January 1st, whatever year it is, in order to get the year in there and have a valid date. That helps me get events in relative order from each other, like just say at least that this person was born before this other person, even if I don't know the exact dates. It gets the ballpark right, but it also makes it possible. So if I'm using this, if all I know is their age, a lot of times a client will just say, well, that person's 25 and that person's 40. And I just kind of need to keep moving. And so that's what the date calculator or the age calculator is for. You just type in a number and it gives you January 1st on that year as subtracted from today's date, which is March 4th, 2020. But I'm going to put in, again, 5/11/1980, hit enter, and then click outside of it to close that, and it sets my birth date here on the diagram to match. So those are always in sync, right? Now if I click 1979, you can see it updated this and updated the age, etc. And then you can add in a location here, and I was born in Anchorage, Alaska, so I'll just add that in. I wasn't adopted and I'm not deceased. There is a section here for diagram notes, which means, let's just say alcohol. Now if I type that here, it updates the diagram and it adds in each line that I add here onto the diagram. So if I want to say diabetes, I believe that's how you spell it, you can see that because I added a new line here, then it adds a new line there. So it keeps those in sync. I try to keep these as short as possible because real estate on the diagram is really comes at a premium. It's you want to save as much space as you can. So I try to keep these to 1 or 2 lines, maybe 1 or 2 words each. And then if somebody is reporting something that isn't a fact, for example, somebody either has a diabetes diagnosis or they don't. But let's say, what's a real subjective thing somebody says? I don't know, problematic or difficult. That's a good one. Difficult. The person I'm talking to may call this person difficult, and that's not really a fact. And so when that happens, I just try to use the exact words that they said, and then put them in quotes, so that I have that information that maybe that will lead me to a fact later on. But I want to make sure that it's obvious that it's subjective and to capture exactly what was said. And maybe I'll say, you know, Joanna said difficult or something like that. So anyway, that's how you edit the diagram notes. I'm going to leave that in there. And then you've got these 3 items down here. If you click primary, it just it draws an extra box around them. So that's usually the client or the person who's taking on this project of doing the family research effort. Open this up again. And then there's this checkbox here to just make the font bigger. Sometimes I want some people to be a little more pronounced if I'm trying to make a printable diagram or a diagram that looks good on the projector, for example. And then there's also this this checkbox here that just hides the details altogether. And that is really useful when you have a lot of people in the diagram and you just want to hide the text for some people so that other people stand out. And that's going to be different for every diagram in my experience. So there's a couple more dates here. I shouldn't have skipped over these, I guess. But you can add in adopted date, and you can see here that when I move this date slider, it actually moves the dot for that event on the timeline, so it keeps everything in sync. Um, and you can see also that oh, I suppose I didn't program it to add that in. It would be a dot, and then it would have that date. Maybe that's a good idea for the future. But if I add in the deceased date, oh no, my mistake. It does add those two in. This is a good tutorial video then, because this is a common pitfall. You'll see here that I have adopted and deceased, and I have dates for them, and they're both in the past, and they're both after the birth date, which is the way they should be. And then the adopted date should always be after the birth date and before the deceased date. However, if we look at the diagram, well, there's a number of things that kind of seem like they're out of sync here. It shows that this person is 10 years old, but they're, if they're born in 1980, they're obviously not that old. Now, as I said before, the date is updated according to the current date being shown in the diagram. So that's obvious enough. But if I move here, then you can see that it adds in the adopted date, right? So let's open up those properties again and do this with that open. So it's always keeping the diagram in sync. So it's showing that adopted date as I pass over the dot here on the diagram, because that dot shows, signifies the date of adoption. And then it should not be shown if the current date being shown in the diagram is before that event. So if I'm scrolling through time and past that event, it should show up on the diagram. Now the next one on the diagram is going to be the deceased date. So nothing happens in here except for the age, the changes in the age. But then when I go to this other dot at the end, that's going to match up with 3/3/2020, which was yesterday. So then once I go over that, it's going to update this with an X for deceased and then add in that deceased date. So everything, the principle here, the design principle is that the diagram should always be in sync with whatever date it is. And a main design principle for both the data that you're putting in and the diagram app itself is that everything, as much as possible, should have a relationship in time. It should, that adopted date is an event that happened at a certain time, the death that happened at a certain time, and that makes it possible for this timeline to actually be meaningful. And that requires you to go in and enter the data, which is much more tedious than just drawing a two-dimensional family diagram as a thumbnail sketch of the family. So this is getting much more involved into the data entry in order to be able to see things we hadn't seen before when we have an animated diagram with a lot more going on, with a lot more people. So that is some basics there. Now, that is just one page here on the person sheet. There's a few more, and I'm not going to get into these so much now, but I'll just mention that there's the first tab is the basic stuff, basic details. The second tab is a timeline, and you'll see that it automatically is accumulating events in here as I'm adding the events here. So I added a birth date, I added an adopted date, a deceased date, and those show up here in this personal timeline for John Smith. And then I also have a tab here for notes where I can write anything I want, and it doesn't really go anywhere. It just it's just a place for you to type. And when somebody's telling me about someone's story, I just kind of write the notes in here. It's just a notepad, but that becomes very useful. And then the meta tab, this is kind of a whole new bag of complexity that I'm going to get to later in a video about layers and tags, which is probably it's one of the more advanced ways to use the app So I'm going to click done here to close this diagram, or to close this person properties sheet. Zoom out here with my mouse. There's a trick to be able to pan the diagram around. You hold down the Option key and you'll see that cursor changes when I drag my mouse with the Option key down. So if I do that and click, I can move the diagram around. So if I zoom in a whole bunch, then it lets me kind of move around the diagram like this while I'm still zoomed in. And then I can use the wheel to zoom out, or the two fingers on the trackpad up and down, basically the scroll function with that Option key held down, and it lets me zoom in and out. So that's the basic principle here, is that you select an object and then you inspect it with this I button. Another way to do that is to select the object and then do Command I, which is a standard Mac shortcut for inspect. Close that. But you can do that on a lot of these different objects. So you can do that on a pair bond. So let's do that on this pair bond here. I drew this box to select it. It's green now, which well, on my computer, selected things are green. It might be a different color for yours, but depending on your operating system settings. But now I'm going to click inspect, and it's going to pull up a different property sheet that's specific to pair bonds. So you don't have a name for a pair bond, so there's no name here. So there's different information that you're going to edit for the pair bond. And right now, there are, you can basically a pair bond can be married or not. And if I unselect this married checkbox, you can see that it draws this. I'm going to zoom in here. It draws this pair bond with a dashed line. But if I select it again, it draws it as a solid line. Then if I add in a date here, and actually before I do that, I'm just going to make some more room. So if I add in a date, let's say, 2/3/1990, even though that doesn't quite make sense getting married at 10, but that's all right. Click outside of this box to close it. You'll see that the date shows up right here. So M means married, and that's the date they were married. Now if I unselect married, then it draws them as a non-married pair bond. So that would be like, girlfriend, boyfriend type of thing, but not actually married. And it removes the date because they're not married. So this date is now irrelevant. But if I reselect it, then it reappears. Same thing for a separated event. Although for this one, I'm not going to add in the date because maybe I don't know that right now. But you'll notice that it added in this slash. So one slash means separated. So if I turn it on and off, it turns on and off on the diagram. 2 slashes means divorce. So if I click this, it means divorced. And then if I type a date in here, let's just say they were divorced 4 years later, 2/3/1994. Click outside to close it. And it adds in that divorce date. So now we've got a marriage date and a divorce date. Same thing with the person. If I drag the current date on the diagram through those two events in time, and you'll see them right here on the timeline at the bottom, then they update accordingly. You see this changing from let's say married to, well, rather separated to divorced. You'd see 1 slash and 2 slash, and then you also see it going from, with the text, it goes from just having the married date to having the married and the divorce date. Now, when I drag backwards, that separated slash never goes away because I don't have a date for it. So if I were to add in a date here to say, well, let's say 1 year or 2 years after, so let's just say 5/1/1992. It adds in another blip here on the timeline, and it disappears. The separated slash disappears from the pair bond because the current date that I'm showing with this slider here is before that separated date. Then when I go through it, there's the married date, then there's separated, right? And then it shows them being divorced. There is another setting here called custody, and you can select which person got custody if you wanted, and it just tilts the slashes. That's all it does. And you can reset that like this to go back to normal. This also has a diagram notes, and you can add in, sometimes I add in a location here, like let's just say Anchorage, AK. And then this has the same font to checkbox to make the font bigger or to hide the details altogether. Now there's also a timeline here, and it's doing the same thing as it did for the person. It's adding in married, separated, divorced dates, and other events that you can add, and I'll go over that in a later video. This also, the pair bond properties also has that notepad where you can type whatever you want here. And then it also has a meta tab that I'll get to in a later video about tags and layers. So that's how you edit a pair bond. It's the same principle for editing an emotional process symbol. You just select it, go over here, click inspect, or do Command I, which is the keyboard shortcut I use, and you can change the type to any one of the other ones. Let's just call it reciprocity, and it adds the arrows, or you can change it to fusion. Go back to conflict. You can change the people. So here I have John here listed, and if I do this, it's going to change this from one person over to John. And there's only one person listed here because there are no other names here listed for the other people, and so this box wouldn't know what to add in there, and you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. But if I do this, let's just say I pick John here. See, it's going to reassign the other end of this symbol to John. And then this button here just flips it around, although with conflict it doesn't matter which way it's going. But for the other symbols, like let's go to this one, I'm just going to click that once, right? And it selects this symbol, and then it swaps out the properties here. So that's a toward symbol, one of my speculative emotional process symbols. And now if I flip this, well, actually this one is that's another bad example. Let's go to this define self symbol, open that one up, and if I flip this, it just changes the direction of the symbol. So some symbols have direction, some don't. Now all symbols have a start date and an end date. And so to add a start date, it's the same thing. You just type it in here, and let's just say this define self move happened on New Year's Eve of the millennium with the kid. So this is a ways after this marriage gets going, this thing is happening. And all that does, the start and end date, is define when that symbol appears on the diagram. So if I drag this, well, you'll notice that nothing's happening, even though this bar is before, so it's currently showing 1996, and the start date is 2000. So this symbol hasn't happened yet, but it's still showing. So why is that? It's because it's selected. That's a good thing to remember, is that whenever something's selected, it's not going to disappear, because that causes all kinds of problems on the diagram. So all I have to do is click outside to deselect it. Property sheets go away when you deselect the symbol. And now, when I move that just one tick, so it disappears. So now it's in sync. So remember that I set the start date of that define self symbol to be the Millennium New Year. So it should reappear as I drag this slider through that day. There it is. So that's when that event happened. Now that symbol persists, it stays on the diagram basically forever after that point. Disappears before it, stays on the diagram forever because I haven't specified an end date. So let's say for this one, I just want to say, usually for this defined symbol, a defined self move, it's a solitary event. It's a discrete event that happened at one moment, or an incident or something like that, where one person tries to define self in relation to another in a new way. And so I usually, for this symbol, use it, just have the start and end date be the same so that it only shows up on one day. Well, and I guess I made a mistake there that I'll have to work out later. But that's the idea. So let's add this thing back in just for the interest of time. Okay. So there's that symbol again. And instead of having it on the same day, I'm going to just say, just for example's sake, I'm going to say this next year is the end date. So what that's going to do is it's going to make it so that it's only visible during the year 2000. It's just the principle I'm showing here. So that's how you edit objects. The idea is that you select the item, you click inspect or do Command I, and then you get this property sheet that tells you what you're editing up here at the top. And then if you want to edit, so now I'm editing this person. If I want to edit this person, I just click once on them, it selects them, and it swaps out the property sheet, and now I can edit this person. Click once on this conflict symbol, and now it swaps it out. Now I'm editing the conflict symbol. Same thing for the pair bond, etc., etc. So you always have this property sheet here, and you're always editing one or more objects at a time. So there is one tip here. You can edit more than one item at a time. So let's say, let's say all these people have passed away. So I'm just going to draw this box and hit inspect. And then I'm going to click deceased. And so it just sets them all to deceased. It's a really fast way to move through this kind of thing. You'll notice that when I did that, it also selected this reciprocity symbol, but I didn't edit it, because whenever you have more than one type of an object selected, it prioritizes people. That's just a default that I set. So it's editing 7 people right now. Now, if I go up here and type the name and say they're all Mary, it's actually going to set that name on every person. So that's not something you would want to do probably, but you may want to change their size all at the same time. Do something like this, and then drag and reorganize, for example. Now you've got a smaller piece of this family that's a little more manageable. Maybe you want to leave these bigger because you talk about them more. So anyway, that's the basics. I hope this was helpful. It was a little bit more in depth on how to edit the items on the diagram. And there'll be more videos that cover more features. And so good luck.